Gutenberg has over 2,400 one-star reviews in the WordPress.org plugins repository and only 800 or so five-star reviews. It has an overall aggregate rating of 2 stars. With Gutenberg seemingly so reviled, full disclosure, I don't think these numbers actually reflect the overall community sentiment, but with it seemingly so reviled, what's the alternative? Classic Press is a fork of WordPress that began back before WordPress bundled Gutenberg into WordPress 5.9. Since then, it's continued to be maintained as an alternative, and it touts its speed and smallness. It's basically the WordPress equivalent of Backdrop for Drupal, which is a continuation of Drupal 7 for teams that didn't want to upgrade to the new Drupal architecture that was introduced in 8+. So with Pantheon able to do custom upstreams and the roots of Classic Press being in WordPress, I wondered if I could make a Classic Press site or run Classic Press on Pantheon, and just to get an idea of what Classic Press was about. So the first thing I did was find Classic Press on GitHub. I found that they have two main repositories. There's one that looks like it's a development repository for Classic Press itself, and then the other one is a releases repository, which is a mirror of like the final shipped product. The releases version seemed to fit what I was looking for if I was going to use it on Pantheon and use that as a custom upstream. It has WordPress, the WordPress core software, Classic Press code base. But I realized pretty quickly that because we add necessary files and configurations, I'd probably need to make a custom upstream off of this. So I forked that Classic Press releases repository, and then I added in our Pantheon YAML, Pantheon upstream YAML, wp-config, and wp-config Pantheon files. And one of the things that I discovered is that the releases repository ships a Composer JSON file. I like Composer, so I decided that's an easier way to manage plugins. Our WordPress core repository automatically pulls the latest, whatever's latest in our Pantheon MU plugin repository and ships it alongside WordPress with each new WordPress release, meaning that with every time there's a WordPress update, it's going to pull whatever we have in the MU plugin. But with Composer, that means I could use Composer to get those updates when they're available, when we do releases on the MU plugin. So that makes that a lot easier. The Composer file, though, that ships with Classic Press, didn't include anything like WP Packagist or where to install plugins into the paths that they need, which comes from Composer installers. So both those are pretty necessary for managing WordPress dependencies with Composer. So I had to do massaging with the Composer JSON file to get it to where I wanted it to be. And then once it was there, I added some Pantheon defaults. I added Pantheon Advanced Page Cache, which is sort of a must to interact with our global CDN. And that was where I ran into my first Classic Press compatibility issue. See, Pantheon Advanced Page Cache requires WordPress 6.4 or higher. And the current version of Classic Press identifies as 6.2.3, which is weird because everything in the Classic Press admin refers to Classic Press, and it says you need a newer version of Classic Press for plugins that aren't compatible, but there are no newer versions of Classic Press. It's because Classic Press is replacing WordPress in all of those instances. And that means that any WordPress plugins that require a WordPress version before 6.4 just won't work on current Classic Press. And in fact, it's not just that they don't work or they say that there's a problem, but you actually physically can't activate them. You can't do it through WP CLI, and you can't do it through the admin. So I dropped my dependency requirement in my Composer file for Pantheon Advanced Page Cache from 2.0 to 1.5. This also means I don't get updates since we're not updating that branch ever since 2.0 came out. But it does mean that I can get it to work, and it does mean that I can have that interaction with the global CDN caching. I also added WP Native PHP sessions, which is nice to have if doing anything with sessions. And then as I was customizing my site, I decided that I wanted to use the ClassicPress theme. ClassicPress ships with two themes. It ships with 2017 and maybe 2016. I don't remember what the other one was. But it also ships with the ClassicPress theme. And this is the theme that they actually use on the ClassicPress website. And since that's unique to ClassicPress, I was like, well, let's use the ClassicPress theme. The problem with the ClassicPress theme is their theme has no title at the top. It has no H1. It just uses their logo. So I decided that I would use the ClassicPress logo from their website. And I downloaded the logo. And that logo was an SVG file, which is great for, web stuff. But SVGs can't be uploaded to ClassicPress out of the box. So then I went looking for an SVG plugin. I found one by TenUp, but again, I ran into the compatibility issue there because it required a newer version of WordPress. So then I settled with a different plugin that adds SVG support. It's actually the most installed plugin that's right next to the, it's got like 1 million installs or something in the WordPress.org repository. So it's arguably the better one, but I trust TenUp. Anyway, it's compatible back to WordPress 4. Something, and I added that to the composer file. So that basically gave me everything I need for my ClassicPress upstream. It's working now. I did have to set build step to false in the Pantheon YAML files to get new ClassicPress sites to deploy. So there's an extra step of flipping that to true if you want to use Composer to manage plugins like I do. So then I started wondering, what else can I do with ClassicPress? And the first thing that I thought of is, can I install Object Cache Pro on ClassicPress? The Terminus-based Object Cache Pro installation method fails because we're using a Composer-based WordPress, even if it's not the Bedrock Composer-based WordPress, and the image that runs those operations, they don't run on your application server. They run on a separate container, and that container doesn't actually have the code base. So if you're installing things, like, it doesn't actually have the stuff that it needs. So that Terminus process, the workflow failed. The Terminus, it started the job and then the job failed. But I was able to follow the Composer-based installation steps and only make a few just minor mental notes when it talks about like the application.php file and using config define instead of define. Obviously those things are the things that, like, I know that I wrote that document, so I know that those are the things I need to use. But that also gave me an opportunity to play with secrets. So when I got so in the Composer-based instructions, you run a command to give you the Object Cache Pro API key that is used, that then gets added to your WP config file. Instead of doing that, I did do that, but then I stored that API key in a secret, and then I'm using Pantheon get secret for my API token, so that my API token isn't actually committed to the repository. And this is actually just a good security practice, and it gave me an excuse to play with Pantheon get secret, and it works pretty much how I expected it to. So that's great. Then I decided, well, this is a dumb idea, but can I install Gutenberg on ClassicPress? And turns out you can't. I went back even to find the Gutenberg version in their releases history to find the version that supported 6.2 point whatever. And I tried to install that version, but because there are specific supporting classes, specifically the error that I got had to do with like block patterns that are missing from the core ClassicPress software, Gutenberg won't install, it just fails, which makes sense. Although it was interesting to note that there was nothing technically stopping me from clicking the activate button when I got a compatible seeming version. So why would I do this? Well, partially I was just curious. I wanted to see what ClassicPress was. It feels a lot like using WordPress from just 5 years ago. And it's nostalgic, but maybe not necessarily in a good way. I would probably not use ClassicPress over WordPress for much of anything. And it's a pretty good reminder of like how far we've come with WordPress since that fork was made. But it also reminds me of Backpress. And if you don't know what Backpress is, it's basically like WordPress without the words. It was all the parts of WordPress that you get for free without it necessarily being a content management system. So you get like the user management and authentication permission stuff. You get like taxonomies and content types, all the various APIs that are part of WordPress that you don't really think about, but can be useful outside of WordPress. Maybe you're building like a mobile app or something, and you don't need the WordPress parts. You don't need the content management stuff, but you do want to have just a framework that you can build stuff on top of. I actually used once upon a time a Backpress to power a PHP application that I was building that didn't need to be a whole WordPress site. That's sort of, and back in the day, Backpress was the thing that powered bbPress and BuddyPress and GlotPress, which are all standalone applications at the time. But since they've been moved into WordPress plugins, Backpress kind of fell along the wayside. So ClassicPress feels a little bit like this, and I can see it filling maybe a similar role since Backpress is no longer really a thing. If you wanted to spin up a web application, but you don't need all the Gutenberg editor stuff, you don't want to write everything by hand, maybe that's a way to do that. Once upon a time, I would have told you that you can build anything in WordPress. It doesn't need to be a website. It can be anything. But the reason why ClassicPress is smaller in size is because it doesn't include all the Gutenberg stuff. Gutenberg is a huge plugin, and all the associated libraries, things that you don't need if you're not using that part of WordPress. So don't use my upstream, or do, I guess, if you want to play with ClassicPress. But we can't support it, and I don't really think it's better than modern WordPress. More than anything, this experiment to me just proved how flexible and utilitarian custom upstreams can be, especially when you want to have a set of opinionated defaults for the sites that you create. I'm going to include the links down below for all the things that we talked about, and check it out, play with it, or don't. It was an interesting experiment.